Hello and welcome back to another video. In this one I'm going to talk you through my build and playstyle for my character in Elden Ring. This is a build that I like to call the triple threat, as it's based around the idea of having 3 daggers in your weapon slots, one in your main hand, one in your offhand, and everyone knows behind Vendron's beard lies another dagger. So there's quite a lot to cover here, so let's get started. I've just hit level 80 in the game, which I would consider sort of the midpoint of the game, maybe halfway through. I feel like in terms of the main story and the map, I've covered probably about half, but equally I feel like I've got just as much to cover again that I haven't discovered yet. So this build is very much based around sort of the mid-game, and you'll see the way I've put my skill points into different attributes here in a second. So at level 80, the skill points I've got at the minute, I've put 30 into Vigor, and the reason for that is really just for that extra survivability, especially in boss fights. This build is very much based around light armor and no shields, so you really need a few more points in Vigor just to make sure you can withstand a few hits, especially in the tougher fights of the game. I've got 20 points in Mind at the minute, and that's just to make sure we have enough in our FP, the blue bar, to use our weapon skills. There's a few of the weapon skills that I'll cover later on which are quite expensive in terms of your FP, your focus points, so I like to have at this point 20 points in Mind. Seems very sustainable. And another 20 points in Endurance. In this build as well, you'll see there's a lot of running around, dodging, and a lot of fast dagger attacks, and that costs quite a bit of stamina whenever you put all those things together, so I like to make sure there's enough points in Endurance to keep me going through the fight, and you'll see why later on as well. I don't think I've put any points into Strength. We focus more on Dexterity in this build, so you can see I've got 31 points into Dexterity, and that's probably the attribute that I'll focus on for the rest of the game as well. I've got no points in Intelligence because I don't use any spells whatsoever in this build. I've put 18 points into Faith, and that's just to allow me to use a few of the incantations, which I'll cover later on. And finally, I've got 20 points in Arcane, and the reason for that is just for one of the daggers is our main bleed ability. That Arcane does affect that and increases the bleed damage and build up. So 20 points in Arcane seems pretty comfortable for me right now. Moving on, let's have a look at the equipment we're using. So the build is based around this Reduvia dagger here at the minute. This is kind of our main dagger. It's great in terms of the physical bleed build-up that it does, but it also has a unique ability called Reduvia Bloodblade, which you can see is like a ranged dagger attack. And that will also cause bleed build-up to the enemy. The thing with daggers is their range is very, very short, and sometimes you just can't get that close to a boss or an enemy. So having a ranged attack for a dagger is very, very handy, and the Reduvia Bloodblade is definitely a really good choice for that one. In the offhand, we have our Misericord. I think I'm pronouncing that right with the accent over the E, so I'll just go with Misericord for now. This is a very kind of basic dagger in terms of it doesn't have any unique abilities or anything. However, I've put Bloody Slash on it. Now I don't use Bloody Slash, but the passive effect for Bloody Slash causes blood build-up as well. So whenever you combine that with your Reduvia in your main hand, you have quite a quick blood build-up and quite a lot of damage whenever that blood hemorrhage effect takes place as well. So those two paired together, the Reduvia and the Blood Misericord, work really well. And also with the Misericord, you can see it's got a very high crit chance of 140. So those two, whenever they work together, they do a lot of damage very quickly, and the bleed effect comes very quickly and it builds up very quickly. So those two are a really great pairing from what I've seen so far. And the third dagger we have in our arsenal is the Black Knife. Now this one here, again, in terms of the flat damage it doesn't do a great amount compared to the other two. However, it has a unique ability called Blade of Death, and this is a really strong ability, especially in the start of boss fights. And again, it's another ranged ability for a dagger. Ranged abilities for daggers are very handy because, like I said, sometimes you just cannot get that close to a boss, and the range in this one's very good. So this is kind of a really powerful attack like that. But what it does is whenever it hits for the first time, it takes it reduces the boss's health or enemy's health by 10%. So even from that very first hit, you've already taken 10% off the boss's total health. But then it also puts a burn on the target as well, which is it does damage over time. Even whenever you've stopped physically attacking the boss, it'll still kind of tick away and do damage in the background. So once I've won boss fights just by using that one ability. Whenever you use it sparingly. it's quite expensive in terms of how much it costs, and that's why we have that extra skill points in mind, just to make sure that we have enough of our FP to keep us going through those longer fights. So those are our three daggers, the Reduvia, the Misericord, and the Black Knife, and all three of them grouped together do a really good combination of attacks, really handy for boss fights and in various different situations. So this is why it's called the triple threat, and this is why I've really found a lot of fun and enjoyment out of these three daggers kind of playing off each other. Works really well. Another weapon I've grown quite fond of is the whips, and this one here is the Urumi whip. Again, I may be mispronouncing that, but this is a fairly standard whip. But what I've done is I've put a frost build-up on the whip. I've got the Determination Ash of War on there at the minute, and the passive effect is it causes a large amount of frost build-up to an enemy. And what that means is I've kind of just recently discovered this with the frost effect, but whenever you put frost on an enemy, it reduces their defense and also means they take more damage from your attacks. Again, really handy for some of those bigger, stronger enemies that just aren't going down quick enough. Once they have the frostbite effect on them, it's really handy. But also, it's another melee weapon that has a really long range to it. And there's certain enemies in the game that are made out of rock, clay, or crystal, and sometimes your daggers and your swords just seem to glance off them by doing very, very little damage, and it can be quite frustrating. But with the whip, not only does it do good damage to them, but it also staggers them slightly as well, which I'll show you later on. It kind of interrupts them, so you can kind of create more openings for yourself just by whipping them. And every time you do a whip, it causes that frost build up, and yeah, they go down quite quickly in the end. So I'll show you some footage of that later on as well. In terms of our ranged weapon, we have the black bow here at the minute. Again, a fairly standard bow, but the good thing about bows, which I quite like, is you get access to quite a few different varieties of arrows. So you've got fire arrows, poison arrows, you've even got like blood arrows and sleep arrows as well. So there's certain enemies you might want to put to sleep in order to focus on other ones, and that's where your bow comes in. Yeah, and it's come very, very handy for me to use a bow, especially for some of the flying enemies in the game, like the bats and the falcons that just tend to annoy you. It's quite hard to hit them just with daggers at such a short range, and that's whenever I'd switch over to the bow, keep them at a distance, and take them out one by one. Again, very handy, and I'll show some footage of that later on. And finally, I have a claw mark seal just in my last weapon slot. Now, any finger seal would do for this because I'm not using any offensive incantations. I'm just using a few of the utility ones, which I'll cover later on. But the claw mark seal, again, it was one I picked up fairly recently. I seem to have upgraded it to level 12 here at the minute, and it's done pretty good for me so far. I'm going to cover my incantations later on, but for now, I'm just going to move on to the armor that I'm using. Now, you can kind of see the armor I'm using is purely just for how it looks. I don't pay too much attention to how the numbers affect the gameplay, because for me it's quite important to have a character that looks the way I want them to look. So for this look, you can see I've gone for like a traditional Dungeons and Dragons style rogue, assassin, thief type character. And to achieve that, I've got the black hood as my head slot. I've gone for the vulgar militia armor in my chest, the confessor's gloves in the hands, and the bandit boots. And all those together, I think, make a pretty good looking rogue character. Occasionally I will switch the chest piece out to the raptor's chest piece, raptor's black feathers. And the reason for that is that the raptor's feathers will enhance my jump attacks and make them a bit stronger. So depending on what the boss is doing or what I'm fighting, sometimes I'll switch those two pieces around. But if I had to choose, I would just go with the vulgar militia armor because I think it looks good with the black hood. Moving on from that, I'm just going to talk about the talismans I'm using at the minute. I've just recently unlocked my 4th talisman slot, and you can kind of see with my talismans, they're not too exciting, to be honest. They're really just in terms of defense and utility. So you can see I've got the Blessed Dew talisman just to slowly restore HP. Now I find this one quite handy, especially whenever you're going through dungeons and catacombs, because there's times in between when you're fighting enemies, you might just be exploring, and with this talisman on, your HP is always coming back slowly, and it means in between fights you're recovering health, and it can save you one of your health flasks later on. It is very, very slow recovery, and it's not to be relied on for like a boss fight or something, but for general exploration you can recover your health really quick, oh, well, slowly, but in the background, and it's free health that you're getting back, so I find that one quite good. The Crimson Amber medallion just raises my maximum HP, which again I find useful because I'm not using heavy armor and I'm not using any shields, so any amount of extra health I can get is very handy for me, so that's why I've gone with that one. I'm also using the green turtle talisman, which is raising my stamina recovery speed. With this build, later on you'll see I'll do a lot of sprinting, dodging, and all of the flurry attacks as well. That all takes away quite a lot of stamina. And I find having that talisman on just means that my stamina is coming back quite quickly, and I'm never really worrying too much about running out of stamina and having to, wait or panic for too long. And then my last slot, I'm going with the blue feathered branch sword, and this raises defense whenever my HP is low. Again, it's purely a defensive talisman I've put on here, nothing too fancy. Sometimes I'll switch it around for the crimson dagger, which will restore HP whenever I do critical hits. But I find rather than rely on critical hits to restore HP, I'd rather just have that defense whenever my HP gets low, and that way I don't have to worry about it. So as far as the items down here go, this is kind of purely optional. You can fill these slots with anything at all. But I like to have a couple of the poison spray mists and the spark aromatic as well. These two are quite good, and I'll cover them later on. But it's just kind of for whenever you've got groups of enemies, these can take them out quite quickly. And another item I wanted to talk about was the exalted flesh. This is really handy for any kind of fight where you're just kind of struggling a little bit. It boosts your physical attack, and because most of our attacks are physical with the daggers, I find this a good item to use just before a fight or in the middle of a fight, just to kind of give you a bit of extra damage. I also want to cover in my pouch over here, I would use poison bone darts quite a lot, and the reason for that is they're free. You'll see if I go back into my equipment, some of the other darts, they cost FP whenever you throw them, like the crystal darts cost 1 FP, and sometimes you're throwing between 5 and 10 darts at a time, so that can cost you about quite a bit of your energy whenever you're using them repeatedly. But the poison darts, they don't cost anything at all, and I quite like them because whenever you throw about 4 or 5 darts, poison darts on a target, it gives them the poison effect. And from what I can see, that poison effect lasts for quite a long time, and again does continuous damage. Whenever you're not even hitting the boss, it'll still poison them and do damage in the background. So, and again, it doesn't cost anything to use them, so I find them very handy in between some dagger attacks, throwing out a few poison darts and getting that poison effect on the enemy as soon as possible. And I want to talk about the spirits I'm using as well. So I've gone more or less from the start of the game by using the demi-human ashes spirit. You can see I've collected quite a few already, but this is the one I keep coming back to because I just find them really unique and interesting, and they've been extremely helpful during boss fights for me. It summons 5 of the demi-human spirits, and as far as I'm concerned, that's 5 more targets that a boss could hit other than me. And these guys just sort of run around causing chaos, and the boss is distracted with them, which means it creates a lot more openings for me to slip in, do dagger attacks, and get back out again. And these guys are a great distraction. Also at nighttime they become stronger, so their attacks do a lot more damage, and they've got more health whenever you're fighting with them at nighttime. So I find them to be a really useful spirit. I've not come across anything so far that's maybe really want to change, so this is a really good part of my build that I've used for many boss fights, and they've been very helpful indeed. And I think that's pretty much it. The only last thing I'm going to talk about is a few of my incantations. So you'll see down the bottom of the screen, one of the main ones I like to use is this one called Darkness. So how this works is it creates an area of darkness in front of you, and any enemies that walk in here will get blinded for a few seconds, which means you can either use that to make an escape or use it to slip around behind and do a critical backstab. And you can do that 2 or 3 times. You can keep blinding them, keep backstabbing them, and it's really handy for some of the stronger spearmen type enemies, the ones with the big spears and big shields. I tend to struggle with them quite a lot just because of the range of their attacks compared to the range of mine. They normally have quite a big advantage, so whenever I cast Darkness on them, very handy for slipping in behind and just getting a few more backstabs. The only other incantations I would use would be an urgent heal if I'm really panicking and I've maybe run out of health flasks, or I'm just in that situation where I just want to pop a very quick heal. Assassin's Approach I would use every now and again if I'm trying to maybe drop down on an enemy, or I'm in an area where it's going to make a lot of noise. And the Assassin's Approach basically just means I can approach an enemy silently and not worry about making too much noise or alerting them to my presence. And then last one, I've got Flame Cleanse Me, and this one here just gets rid of poison and Scarlet Rot. So as you sort of progress through the game, especially if you're around Caelid, you'll find Scarlet Rot enemies come in quite thick and fast. So having a cure for Scarlet Rot is very, very handy. And yeah, it's a good sort of utility to have that one in the incantation slot. And that's pretty much it. I don't really have any other incantations I use, but those ones there are definitely the main ones, mainly Darkness. Darkness has been a really, really useful one for me for certain enemies in the game. And that is pretty much it, guys. I'm going to wrap this video up here now and end it with a few clips so you can see how all of this stuff works together, and you'll see how my playstyle involves a lot of movement, a lot of fast, flurried attacks, as well as big long sprints around a boss fight. And depending on the situation, you'll see me use Darkness, you'll see me use the Whip, and all the dagger abilities as well. So thank you so much for watching, and enjoy the rest of the video.